Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and this is the 19th in a 10-part video series where we're learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. As was the case with the previous videos, this video takes advantage of a sample workflow that I've created that you can get by downloading the package that you can get to by going to the URL that you see in the YouTube description down below. If this is your first time working with the VVork examples workflow package, you'll want to go back to video number 14 to learn about it. But assuming you've got that workflow package installed, we can get started. So let's jump in here. In the previous three videos, we talked about block decisions, custom decisions, and decision activities. Those three schema elements in Orchestrator are in effect the schema element equivalent of a JavaScript if-then construct. Now in JavaScript, we have if-then constructs and we have if-then-else constructs, and whether you're working in JavaScript code or you're working with those three decision schema elements that I talked about, you are very likely, very quickly going to run into situations like the one I'm illustrating in the screenshot here. If you take a look in this screenshot, this is obviously a made-up example. It doesn't really do anything, but imagine you had a variable called fruit. And in the variable called fruit, let's say it's an input parameter. The user is going to specify a type of fruit. If we have a variable called fruit and we want the workflow to do one thing if the value of the fruit variable is apple, but do something else if the value of that same variable is banana, but do something else if I think you get the idea here. What you end up with if you're using the branching constructs that we talked about in the previous three videos, or if you're using JavaScript if-then type statements, what you end up with is ugly. Now in this case here, in this particular example, we're only looking at 4 different fruits. But what if we had a basket full of fruits, 20, 30, 40, 50 different kinds of fruits? Do you really want to have to define each of these decision elements that you see in this example? And worse yet, do you want to complicate your workflow by having 20, 30, 40 different decisions in your workflow? In cases like this, in particular, when you're just looking at the same variable but looking for different values, in cases like that, that screams out for you to use something called a switch. Now, in different programming languages, you may have encountered something called a switch, or maybe they called it a case statement. Same name for the same thing. JavaScript has something called a switch statement. And correspondingly, Orchestrator has a switch schema element. Now, in order to understand what this whole switching business is about, let's keep this high level for right now and take a look at the next example workflow. This workflow is simpler. It looks like, okay, it's going to log what type of fruit the user specified, but then we've got this switch statement. Instead of having to have 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 different branching schema elements, we have a single switch schema element. And it branches off in different directions depending upon what the value is of some variable. Now, to keep you from being confused, the variable here isn't the variable called color. It's still the same fruit variable I was talking about before. In this switch statement, we're looking at that fruit variable, and depending upon what the value of the fruit variable is, we're going to branch off in different directions. These schema elements here are just going to do whatever we want done for the different types of fruit. In this case, it's just going to set another variable called color. But these 3 schema elements and what they're doing is irrelevant for our purposes with the switch statement. The switch statement is what we care about. So how do we create one of these switch statements, and how do we define the different paths that we should go from the switch statement depending upon the value of some variable? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this video. But just before we do, an actual coding example, an Orchestrator workflow example, what I'd like to do is go back to a resource that I've mentioned before in video number 13, I believe it was, a website called w3schools.com. So I've gone to w3schools.com/js, and what I want to do here is have you take a look from a JavaScript perspective what these switch statements look like. So in JavaScript, you can create a switch statement like we see defined here. And the basic syntax of a switch statement is switch and then in parentheses, some sort of expression. I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. Then some curly braces. So here's an open curly brace, here's a closed curly brace. And in those curly braces, we define multiple cases of things that we're looking for. So the expression that we defined here gets evaluated. That expression might be a variable, or it could be some other type of expression. Oftentimes it's a variable. So for instance, we might say switch fruit. Fruit would be a variable, that would be our expression. And then if in the case that the expression evaluates to apple, we would change the letter N here to apple, then it'll do this block of code. So we would say in my example before, case apple, do this. Case banana, do this. And you can also have a default statement, which we'll talk about in a moment. But before we get to the default portion of this switch block, notice that within each of the case blocks, there is a statement here that says break. In the case of a JavaScript case statement, this may not be true in other programming languages, but in the case of JavaScript, if you want to enter a case like case equals apple, if the fruit we're looking at actually is apple, we'll execute this code. If you don't want us to consider any of the other cases, then you need to explicitly say break. In the case of JavaScript, if you don't say break, even if you matched in the first case, it'll still go on to the next case and the next case and the next case. You have to explicitly break out of the switch statement if that's what you want. That's the way it works in JavaScript. So looking at a more real-world example here, earlier I said that the switch statement has some parentheses, and in the parentheses you specify an expression. The example I gave was the expression was our variable called fruit. But notice here, this is not a variable. This is, yikes, this is object-oriented programming. We're creating a new date object that gets, and we're using that date object's getDay method to find out what day of the week it is. That's a obviously more complicated expression, but just like a variable expression evaluates to something, this expression is going to evaluate to something. It's going to evaluate to a number between 0 and 6, where 0 is Sunday, all the way through 6 would indicate Saturday. So in this particular case here, if the day of the week expression that we have listed here returns 0, then they're setting some variable called day to the string Sunday. On the other hand, if it returned 1, day is Monday, 2, day is Tuesday, and so forth. So here we can see all these different cases. Again, since we're breaking out of each one, then we don't have to worry that we're going to match different cases. Break does not break you out of the case. Break breaks you out of the entire switch. So we've got case 0 through 6 here, and that code works. But I seem to recall, is it in this part? Oh, where's that example? I know somewhere here on W3 schools.com, they show you how to use the default statement. So imagine, if you will, in this particular example here, what if for some crazy reason, instead of this expression returning the number 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, what if it returned 7 or 8 or -14? Those are not values that we're expecting to see. So that's what the default statement allows you to do. The default, unlike the cases where you say case apple, case banana, or case 0, case 1, the default statement is just default : and then a code block that says what to do if none of these cases matched. So for instance, in our day of the week example, we could say cases 0 through 6, and then default alert, warning, yikes, that's an invalid day of the week, crash program, dump stack, or whatever you wanted to do. Default is the catch-all. If none of the cases before matched, do this. All right, so again, that's JavaScript, and you're free to use these case statements within the JavaScript code that you create in your Orchestrator workflows. So if you have a scriptable task and you want to do switch statements, knock yourself out. But what I want to talk with you about is how we can do a similar sort of thing for our workflows instead of doing the switching within a scriptable task, which would kind of conceal from us in this workflow, we wouldn't see what was going on. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use the switch schema element that we talked about before. So let's look at this actual example here. As you can see, we have a workflow called fruit colors, not a terribly original or real-world example here, but a workflow called fruit colors. And it takes one input parameter. It asks the user to pick a fruit, and that fruit is going to be a string. Now, we'll tackle this later on, but if that's all we did, we better use a default sort of case statement, because if we're just going to ask the user to type the name of a fruit, they could type anything they want. They could type apple, banana, cherry, date, and so forth, but they could type literally anything they wanted. And we probably need to handle that gracefully. One way to handle that gracefully is to have a default statement that says, yikes, you typed a name of a fruit I wasn't expecting. But I'm also going to show you another trick. As an added bonus in this video that's supposedly just about switch statements, I'm also going to show you something very, very cool that you can do with input presentation. But in the meantime, let's go look at our schema. I don't think our workflow actually returns anything, so there's no output parameters. There is one input parameter called color, which is set to unknown by default. But let's look at the schema. So the user runs the workflow. The workflow asks the user to pick a fruit. We'll log that fruit. This just does a system.log, logs the type of fruit that they selected. And then we enter this switch statement. And depending upon what fruit they pick, we're either going to go this path or this path or this path or this path. Now, you can't see this just yet, but one of these is our default path and the other three are paths based on specific values. But before we even worry about what these paths are doing, let's go look at the switch statement. So if we edit the switch statement, the info tab is the usual sort of thing. Not really anything new for me to say there. The scripting tab is grayed out because with the switch statement, you do not define the JavaScript. We do that for you. In the case of a switch statement, the place you really need to go is this cases tab, where, let me scoot this around a little bit here so that we can see everything going on, where you can see we have 4 different case, well, depending on how you count it, we've got 3 cases and a default case. So by default, we'll get to these cases in a moment, but by default, this switch statement, if none of these cases matches, this switch statement is going to go to item 6. What the heck is item 6? Well, I recognize log color. That's the name of this schema element, but what's this item 6 business? If you've never noticed this before, I never did, even though I saw it hundreds or thousands of times. I never noticed this or never thought about it until I started working with switch statements. But have you ever noticed that when you hover on an icon, let me close this here. When you hover on an icon such as this start schema element, or here we go, the scriptable task that we see here, or the switch statement, or this scriptable task, notice that they all have an item number. In this particular example, this scriptable task is called item number 7. This scriptable task is, remember this number if you would, item number 6. In the case statement, you will always see these item numbers, and you now know how to go look up item numbers like item 6. You will not necessarily see the nice label that we see here, such as log color. So item 6 is called log color. That's why it says item 6 log color. You will always see the item number. You will not necessarily see a label. I'm going to teach you so that you do always see the label, but if you don't know what you're doing in the switch statements, you don't know how to set this label, you've got to understand these item numbers. Okay, so by default, if none of these matches, this switch statement is going to follow this arrow to item number 6, log color. All these other statements that you see here define the different cases that we see illustrated visually over here with these arrows. So let's see what these say. So if fruit, now you can't see this here, but to define this case statement, I had to pick which variable I wanted the switch statement to be looking at. So I said, I want you to look at the variable fruit. If the value of that variable is equal to apple, then go to the schema element called item 8, also known as color equals green. And all this workflow schema element does is it sets the variable color to green. So no big deal there. If the fruit is equal to banana, then we'll go down this path. And if the fruit is equal to cherry, then we go down this third path. And then again, depending upon what type of fruit they choose, I'm setting this color variable to red, yellow, or green. Yes, I know there are red apples and yellow apples and so forth, but apples, in my example here, apples are green, bananas are yellow, and cherries are red. So if you want to, you can get rid of these individual cases. You can change the order that they're evaluated in. You don't see anything about break like we saw in the JavaScript code here, but there is an implicit break for each of these. Actually, I have to double check that. I don't know that that's necessarily true. There is no way to explicitly state break. I'm pretty certain though that there's an implicit, in other words, a break that we set in between each of these. We could try that out in a few moments here, but I seem to recall that you don't have to specify break. Okay, one other thing before we jump a bit further. In this particular example, and in the case, for many, if not most times, when you're defining a switch statement, the individual cases will look at the same variable each time. In this example, it's the same variable each time, but there's no requirement in the switch schema element. There's no requirement that each case has to look at the same variable or even the same type of variable. So this ends up being very flexible. So having seen this here, let's see how we could create this workflow from scratch. Now let me commit this to memory what this looks like. So log fruit, switch, got some cases, log color. Okay, so I think I know what this workflow is supposed to do. By the way, if you don't want to watch me manually create this workflow from scratch, feel free to jump ahead to video number 20. In video number 20, we're going to be doing something a bit different. We're going to start talking about how to create loops within your Orchestrator workflows. On the other hand, if you want to stick around here, let's create this fruit colors workflow from scratch. Okay, so I've renamed the original one, and I'm going to create a new, a new workflow called fruit colors. Now I can actually do this workflow. I can create it in a number of different ways. I don't have to go through one prescribed way of doing things. So in this case here, let's create our variables first. So I need an attribute called color. And I don't have to set a pre-assign a value, but let's go ahead and assign a pre-assign a value, unknown. Color is going to be a string, and well, attribute descriptions, you don't have to type an attribute description because the user's not going to see this, but your other coworkers are going to see this. So yeah, we better type a description here. Color of the selected fruit. All right, so we've got our attribute called color. We're going to create an input parameter called fruit. It's going to be a string. And we'll ask the user to pick a type. If only I could type. Pick a type of fruit. Now, right now, I'm kind of a little bit worried here because if I just say string, the user could type anything they want. Again, in a little bit here, I'm going to show you how, instead of just allowing the user to type any old arbitrary string, we're going to use input presentation to force the user to only choose valid choices. But that'll come later. No outputs for this workflow, so we'll jump over to the schema. And again, I can do different parts of this schema at different times, but I know that I want to have two schema elements that are going to do some logging. One is going to log the type of fruit that the user selected, and the other is going to log the color of that fruit. So let's set that up. So in order to log the fruit, we're going to do a system.log of something. In fact, we're going to do that in both these schema elements. They're going to be doing system logs. But what are they going to log? One of them is going to log the color, So I do a variable binding, bring in the attribute called color, and then in my scripting, we'll just say color colon plus color. And then we're going to do the same thing for logging fruit. So let's see, visual binding, we'll bring in the type of fruit. And then for scripting, we'll say the type of fruit is whatever fruit the user specified. If I wanted to, I could validate and run the workflow and see that things are working, but I'm pretty confident so far. So what we're going to do is drag out a switch schema element. Now's when, if you're ignoring what I was doing before with those scriptable tasks, that's fine, but now you got to pay attention. I'm dragging out a switch statement. All you have when you drag out a switch statement is the default case. The default case is already predefined, but we need to define those other cases. So we're going to edit this switch, and there's an info tab, but we're going to skip it. There's nothing we really need to do here. We're going to skip the scripting tab because we can't do anything on the scripting tab. We can't even go to the scripting tab because it's grayed out. Instead, we'll go to the cases tab. And as I said a moment ago, we already have the default case defined. So by default, we're going to go to item 2, which currently has a label, which is why we're able to see that label down here, nice and easy. But we want to have multiple cases. For instance, if the fruit is apple, or if the fruit is banana, or the fruit is cherry. So for each of those cases, we're just going to hit the add button once, twice, 3 times in this example. And right now, you can see I've got these 3 different paths, but all this stuff down here is a little bit weird looking. What the heck is this? And notice there's no nice label anymore. It's just item 4, item 5, item 6, because these end elements, while they have item numbers, they don't have any labels. So one of the things I like to do to make my job easier, sometimes even before I set up these variables and the types of tests we're going to do, sometimes I'll just go ahead and define the cases, define the arrows, I should say, close the editor, and just drag out, it doesn't have to be a scriptable task, but oftentimes it will be, drag out a scriptable task and drop it on each of those arrows. And then maybe move things around to line them up nicely. We'll move these endpoint arrows, these endpoints a little bit. If I can grab that one. Hang on. My mouse is acting a little weird. There we go. Wasn't quite clicking on it. So I'm just making this look pretty right now. We'll change them here in a bit. But as I said, because it's a little confusing, because these items just have item numbers and no labels, what I like to do is insert a scriptable task or something like that and go ahead and give them some labels. So for instance, this is the apple case, and this is the banana case, and this is the cherry case. I guess we should add a 4th one for date, but this is good enough for our purposes. By defining these, now the switch statement is pointing to something that has a label. Instead of pointing to something that's just called item 4, it's now, the case path is now pointing to apple. That makes it easier for me when I edit the switch to see exactly which of these cases is going to which. So it still says the item number, but it tells me with the label of each. So for each of these, let's see, apple, when do I go down to the apple path? Well, that depends upon the variable called, click here, the variable called fruit. So I'll simply select fruit, click select. And let's see here, if fruit is equal to, equals, if fruit equals apple, I'm assuming capital letter A, apple here. I'll show you how, the danger exists here that the user could type lowercase a-p-p-a-l-e as opposed to capital A-p-p-a-l-e. Again, using the input presentation trickery I'm going to show you here in a little bit, I'm going to make it possible for you to make certain that whether the user types capital A apple or lowercase a apple or capital A, lowercase p, capital, we're going to set this up so that this case test will match any of those. And we'll do the same thing for each of these other types of fruit. Again, in this example here, I'm using fruit in each case, although there's no requirement that the case statement uses the same type, the same variable in each case. In this case, though, we are. And I've now got my cases defined. So what are we going to do here? Well, if I were to validate my code right now, you'll notice I get these warnings because my 3 JavaScript statements that I added in don't do anything yet. So what I'm going to do here is for each of these, I'm going to, let's see, I don't care what's currently in the variable called color, but I do want to change its value. I want to write out a new value. So in the case, if I'm in the Apple branch, if color is going to be changed, we want to change it to, let's see, apples are green. So I'm going to say outward binding so that I can say color equals, if I can hit the equal key, color equals green. I'll just do the same thing for these other cases. So for banana, I'm still going to do visual binding. I'm going to change the value of the color variable, except this time instead of green, we'll say, let's see, bananas are yellow. And then cherries are, you guessed it, cherries are red. Why am I doing that? Well, the reason why I'm doing that, let me beautify this a bit here. Instead of having each of these cases go to a dead end, I can have each case go to some other schema element. So now, whether we go the default path or the apple path, we're going to log the color of an apple. I can do that for each of these. I can say, do the same thing for banana. Oops, I didn't quite drop it on. There we go. You can tell you're going to drop successfully when it puts that box around it. And now I have a workflow that's very flexible. It can handle the different types of fruits that the user selects. In each case, it'll log the type of fruit and it'll log the color of that fruit. So let's actually try this here. We'll run the workflow. And you'll recall one of the types of fruit was banana. So if we submit, the workflow runs successfully. So fruit equals banana, color equals yellow, success. If we pick another type of fruit, it'll also work. But what would happen if we said banana with a lowercase b? If we run that workflow, we'll see that the workflow runs. It ran successfully. It knows that it was banana with a lowercase b, but that's not what we were testing for. In the switch statement, we said if it was banana with a capital B. So as you can see here, we followed the default branch and logged the color. The color that we logged was unknown because that was the pre-assigned value we gave the attribute in the very beginning of the workflow. So why did I do this? Why did I type banana with the lowercase b? Well, one reason why I did that was because we're in this video on switch statements. I wanted you to see how the default branch works. But as an added bonus, since you've stuck with me so far in this video, I'm going to show you some cool things that you can do to with input presentation that will allow you to handle situations like bozo user typing banana with a lowercase b, or bozo user typing something completely wrong. If I just ask for an input parameter that asks for a string, there's no controls over what the user types. So we're going to set up something called presentation. I'm actually going to show you two ways. One's cool and one's really cool, but they both involve input presentation. So let's do this. I'll go to the presentation tab, and in my workflow, I only have one input parameter called fruit, so I'm going to select it. And over here on the right side, you can change the description of that input parameter. It's the same description that you typed when you created the input parameter originally. But what I really want to do here is go down and set a property on that variable. Now, as you see here, when you click the Add Property button, you get a bunch of different choices. For instance, one that's really useful is, where is it hiding? You can say that a particular input parameter is mandatory, or you can say things like the default value is cherry. But what I want to do here is, well, first we're going to look at this one called predefined answers. What the predefined answers property is going to do is say that the user's no longer going to pick the fruit by typing into a text box. Instead, predefined answers is going to tell Orchestrator to automatically generate a drop-down list of the types of fruit that we specify. And since it's a drop-down list, the user can only choose from the choices that we give. So to set this up is really easy. We'll just go over here to the not set link. And what we're going to do is create an array of the fruits. So we'll click on not set, and we'll just add the different fruits. So one of the cases was apple, and notice I typed capital A to match exactly what the switch statement's looking for. I'll insert apple. I'll insert banana. It'll help if I type it correctly. I'll insert cherry. I'll insert date. And is eggplant a fruit? I can't think of a fruit that begins with the letter E, so I'm going to stop there. But in effect, what I'm doing is defining an array of strings where each of the strings is a type of fruit. And if I want to, I can delete a fruit or I can change their position. But ultimately, I just keep inserting these strings. I hit the accept button. And now watch what happens when we run this workflow. Before, when we ran the workflow, a window popped up to ask, using a text box, the window popped up asking us to specify the type of fruit as an input parameter in a text box. But now, when we say run, we get a drop-down list. And there's no way the user can choose a bogus choice here. Well, actually, date is bogus because my workflow's case statement's not looking for that. But predefined answers as a input presentation property is a very, 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 very useful thing to know how to work with. So now you know. But that's not all. What if you wanted not just to have a drop-down list, but you wanted to have the contents of that drop-down list change? Not by changing the workflow and having to come back and redefine the workflow, but what if there was a way to programmatically populate this drop-down list? So for instance, we could give automatically populate a drop-down list showing virtual machines in your environment, or maybe even a list of virtual machines that the user has access to. Or in our case here, maybe you want to produce a list of fruits that are currently in stock. So we want to have some way of programmatically going out to the grocery inventory and see which types of fruits are in stock and populate this list accordingly. Well, we can do that by, instead of using the predefined answers property, there's a similar one called predefined list of elements. And predefined list of elements has this handy little button over here. Do I get a tooltip? I think I get a tooltip. Anyways, imagine a tooltip popping up that says, click this button if you want to call an action to programmatically populate this drop-down list. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to click here. And here's a whole bunch of actions. All of these actions return array of strings because that's what we're trying to put into this drop-down list. But I happen to know I've predefined a action called get fruits. I'll show you what get fruits looks like in a moment in case you're interested. But conceptually is all you need to know is that get fruits is an action that I've defined that returns an array of strings where each of the strings is a type of fruit. So if I say apply, again, if I go run the workflow, I get a drop-down list, but this time it's populated. You can't really tell because there's no difference here, but this is populated with a list of fruits. I'll tell you that was kind of boring. That sort of stole my thunder. So let's actually save this workflow. We're going to go over to our actions. We're going to find that action. There it is. And let's actually see what it looks like. We'll edit it. So this action, what's it do? It declares a new variable called fruits. It sets that variable up with an array object. Then in the second line of code, it assigns to that fruit object It's actually just an array of strings, but it assigns to the fruit object a array of strings, so apple, banana, cherry, and date, and then it returns the fruits because the return value of my action is an array of strings. Now, to prove that this is really working here, I'm going to actually change this code. Now, normally, again, I'm not sure eggplant's a fruit, but whatever. Normally, I'm not suggesting that you would always have to come back here and change the code for your action. Instead, you would have code in your action that says things like, go through the vCenter plugin and dynamically go find out what virtual machines exist right now. Or in this code here, we would write code that programmatically goes into our grocery store inventory to find out what fruits we have in stock. So I'm not suggesting that you come back and just hard code a new list, but rather you make your code here flexible enough to go out and programmatically find out what sorts of items we want in this list. Maybe it's not a list of fruits. Maybe it's a list of data stores, and we only want to return a list of data stores that has at least 20% of free space. So there's all sorts of things you can do here, but I just added eggplant into this list, and if this is working, I should be able to, drum roll please, I should be able to go over to the Workflows tab, run my workflow again, and notice this time we don't have 4 choices. We don't have 3 choices, apple, banana, cherry. We don't have 4. We've got 5 choices because that action's returning what we want displayed in this list. So again, that was an added bonus for hanging out with me here in the last of our branching videos. Input presentation can do tons and tons more things. I don't know when, but I'll do a video on input presentation later on, but I wanted to at least get you head down that route if you've never seen it before. There's tons of things you can do with input presentation. But as far as our branching videos, that's going to be it for now. So we had an overview on branching video. We had the 3 videos on basic decision, custom decision, decision activity, and we just finished up our extra long video on switch statements. So that's it for branching for now. You're well armed to have your workflows branching off in different directions now. But in the next video, what's that going to be? I think video 20. In video number 20, we're going to be switching over to an entirely different concept. Instead of branching in our workflows, we're going to learn how to do looping within our workflows. So super important topic. Go on over to video number 20 and I'll see you there. But wait, there's more. Back around 16 minutes into this video, you may have noticed I stumbled around a bit as I was showing you how to set up a switch statement. I was stumbling because I suddenly realized I didn't know for certain whether or not a switch schema element in Orchestrator has an implicit break in between the different cases. I'd always assumed that was true, but I'd never actually tested it. So I decided to test it. And as you can see, I've created a workflow to test it, and I wanted to step you through this in case you're interested. So notice if I go to the Inputs tab, my test workflow has a single input parameter called myInputParameter. It's type number, and it asks the user to pick a number. Now I wanted to force the user to pick certain numbers, so in the presentation of that input parameter, I created a drop-down list of predefined answers where the only choices that the user can select are the values 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But the real interesting stuff's going on over here in the schema. In the schema, just looking at the schema itself without digging in too deep, you can see that I have a switch statement that's going to look at that input parameter, and for that switch statement we have a default path. If the user types selects some unexpected number, we're going to go to this schema element titled unexpected number. All it does is throw an exception. So as you can see, it just throws the exception message unexpected number. On the other hand, if the user selects for the input parameter the value 1, we'll go here and it will log that. If they select 2, we'll go here. And here's the crux of the matter. I have another case that we're going to go to here that does the same thing. It handles if the user selects 2. Now, typically in a switch statement, we don't expect to see we don't expect to see separate cases for the same value. We would expect to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But here we've got 2 instances of 2. Now, so that you can see what's going on, let's just take a quick look at the code associated with each of these. So if we somehow end up going to this schema element, the log is going to show the message number colon 2a. On the other hand, if we end up going to the second number 2 schema element, the scriptable task does essentially the same thing, but the message is slightly different. It says 2b. So we'll be able to tell real clearly which path we end up going. So let's take a look at the definition of the switch. In the switch, let's work our way a little bit backwards here. So down on the bottom we have our default case. So if the user picks some value for my input parameter that we're not testing for here, we're simply going to go to that unexpected number schema element, this one here. On the other hand, if the user sets the value of my input parameter to 1, we will end up going to this 1 scriptable task. If they specify the input parameter value is equal to 2, we'll go here. So notice that's item 4. On the other hand, we have this third, somewhat strange looking case where if the user sets the input parameter to 2, notice same value, then we're going to go to this other schema element, item 6.2, this schema element here. So again, normally we would expect to see different values being tested for in these different cases. We wouldn't expect to see two cases that are testing for the same value, because if the user specifies my input parameter is the value 2, which of these two cases is going to match? Well, as you've likely already noticed, let me resize this a bit here. Let me make it a little bigger. That's too small. As you've likely already noticed, we can order the cases. We can move them up or down, and they're evaluated in order. What we can't see here is that there is, I've confirmed, there is an implicit break in between each of these different cases. So if the user specifies my input parameter is 1, this case will match. We'll go to this schema element and we'll pop out of the switch statement. On the other hand, if the user sets the value of my input parameter to 2, this case here will match. We'll go to this schema element and then we will implicitly break out of the switch statement. We won't end up going to this third case at all. And to prove that, I'll go ahead and run the workflow, but just before I do, let's validate the workflow to show you that it's perfectly valid to set up, not that you'd want to do this, but it's perfectly valid to set up multiple cases as I have here, both testing the same variable for the same value. So again, let's validate. Is it valid? Sure, it's totally valid. So let's actually run it. So I'm going to run the workflow. And let's go for a number that the workflow is not expecting. That should cause us to hit the default case. So we'll say number is 5. We'll submit the workflow. And when the workflow runs, notice that over here on the variables tab, we see the exception message I mentioned before. We can see that that schema element threw an exception. We can furthermore tell that we went down the default path. And furthermore, if we want to, we can go look at the logs and see not just the exception message itself, but all the other stack trace information and so forth. But that's not what we're testing for. Let's run the workflow again. If we run the workflow and choose 1, that's one of the valid cases that we're looking for. If we submit and say 1, notice that the workflow runs. It's running. It ran successfully. Let me give a little kick here to the vRO client. There we go. Number colon 1. So we must have therefore gone down this path here. And we can see that with the highlighting of the path. Actually, I'm not certain if that highlighting normally occurs. I probably just accidentally clicked that. But now we come to the exciting case. If we run and say 2, again, that's going to cause us to hit that condition where our switch statement has 2 different cases looking for this exact value in this variable. So we'll run it. We'll say submit. The workflow runs. And again, let me give a little prod to the vRO client. As you can see, the logged message says number colon 2a. That corresponds to this schema element. We went through this path. Not this path, but this path. We went through this path because it's listed first in the cases. Actually, it's not first. Let me bring this up. We went to this schema element because the switch statement, after failing to match this first case, matched on this second case. We didn't go onwards to this third case because there's an implicit break after each of these case statements. If there wasn't an implicit break, we would have gone to this next case, it would have matched, and we would have therefore gone through this path, which we didn't. Okay, so that's a quick little example. I believe that's a valid test for what I set out to find out the answer to. If you think my workflow here is not a valid case or a valid test, please feel free to let me know in the comments, or if you have anything to say about this, let me know. But to summarize here, it certainly appears that there is an implicit break after each of the cases in a switch schema element. Okay, folks, that's it for this video. I'll see you over in the next one.